left unsaid. Days that can't be counted by the time till rent. Tomorrow's just another like the one that comes next. The corner of the highway that leads to the job, at the desk by the boss with the elegant watch. The tick of the clock and the tick of the clock mark the moments till the ticking stops.
I'm really excited about this conversation. We're speaking to Fay Bound Alberti, who is a cultural historian of gender, emotion, and medicine, and a professor of modern history at King's College London, where she is the director of the Center for Technology and the Body. She has written a number of academic books, and she has appeared on the TED stage, as well as on NPR and New York Times, The Atlantic, Washington Post. And her latest book is called The Face, A Cultural History. Enjoy the pod. Fay Bound Alberti, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
In the introduction of your new book, you write, quote, "Today, the idea that your face represents who you are seems obvious and natural. And yet, what if I told you that for most of human history, people didn't think this way at all?" End quote. They didn't?
No. Well, my argument really is that it's only as we've had more diverse, urbanized, anonymous populations, at the same time as we've had a more need to control those populations and to develop bureaucracy around them, and the technologies that make that possible, like mirrors and cameras, that we are so obsessed with a single person being a single face. And so there's identity of the face is now completely entangled. But if you think that for most of history, people didn't even see themselves in a mirror, let alone have a picture of themselves in their passport, it says something about this changing importance of the face in history. And I've even called it facehood, this kind of sense that personhood needs to have a human face.
All right. And there is a me search aspect to this book. Do you want to talk about how you might have entered this conversation?
How I became interested? Well, weirdly enough, I got interested initially through the lens of face transplants. And I thought, well, how can you transplant a face when it's, supposedly the kind of essence of a single person and their individuality? And it was only while doing the research that I realized I had prosopagnosia, or face blindness. So I've never really been able to recognize people purely by the faces, but I didn't realize that it was a thing. I don't even really thought about prosopagnosia, and in a sense, that's part of the story that I'm telling, because the desire to know a face and the presumption that you must in order to have a normal brain is only really important because we start identifying people by their faces. And so for the first time, I went on an fMRI scanner and I had my brain scanned, and through a range of different interviews and kind of ways of meeting with people all throughout this book, I thought about really what that means. But my own prosopagnosia and my knowing of people beyond the face, I think, kind of underpinned the broader kind of philosophical question about, what is a face and why does it matter?
So in reading this book, and I've worked for a theater company for my entire life. And so what is theater? Why do we do theater? Well, if we look back in history, theater was done to reflect humanity, to reflect, what we mean, who we are, but in ways that were not literal, because we are beyond that, and so, you think about mask work and other things. And so one of the things I found really interesting is so much hinges around the Victorian era.
Yes.
And really, as I'm reading this book, I'm like, really? Are we still burdened with the things that went on in the Victorian era? So can you talk a bit about that? Because this idea that the outer appearance revealed inner character, that started with the Greeks, I guess, right?
Yeah. So we most associate physiognomy, this idea that you can tell a lot about a person's character by the shape of their features. So physiognomy became popularized by people like Aristotle. And the idea is that if you had small eyes, you lacked vision. If you had a strong chin, you were brave. And there was a whole series of assumptions about a person's face. And we also have assumptions based on biblical ideas about color. So what we now know as race, in terms of whiteness being associated with virtue and goodness and so on, and blackness with evil. So you have these sort of ideas, these philosophical ideas circulating, and they're never a science. But what happens in the Renaissance in particular, because there is a kind of rediscovery of all this classical material, and this is where we start having people being interested in expressing emotions on the stage in very kind of particular ways through a kind of, there's a language of emotion, and it's very theatrical, and it's very deliberate, and it's not supposed to be kind of authentic. It's supposed to be very stylized, and in the same way that portraits are stylized. And then this comes back in the Victorian period, and I think this is very interesting for a number of reasons. For me, we are still living in lots of ways in Victorian headspace when it comes to science. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the things that we take for granted, like the idea of facial expressions being absolute and biological, or like being able to read what a person is thinking, came from this kind of Victorian desire to classify. So with the colonies and with the expansion of cities, you have more people than ever before mingling together. This sumptuary legislation, which meant you were only allowed to wear certain colours, or, hats on a Sunday, and that denoted your rank. All of that changed. And at the same time, you have the growth of material culture, which means that there's much more interest in fashion. You could change your appearance. So how do we fix who a person is? If there's masterless men wandering around, there's crime. How do we label them? And so throughout the colonies and throughout the newly urban environments, you get a desire to classify. And at first, it starts becoming about bits of the body. Let's measure bits of the body. Let's do this sort of biometrics. And Alphonse Bertillon in Paris, who's a prison, he's a police officer. He develops this whole science of kind of, in order to know who's a recidivist and who's coming in and out of prison all the time, we get to measure the little finger. Let's compare who has a big nose rather than a small nose. But of course, all of those are arbitrary. Who decides what's a big nose and a small nose? So you need more specificity. And meanwhile, Francis Galton is developing this a science of the profile. So very interested in mapping a series of profiles in composite photography. And how do you work out who's likely to be a criminal? So increasingly, there's this ancient idea that a person's worth and value and morality is etched on their body in some way, becomes more and more intensified on the face, and it becomes rebranded in scientific terms, although it's never scientific, this sort of physiognomic belief system. And although it's been debunked, we still really think about this. We still think that people have a kind of criminal look, or a devious look, and we impute sort of emotions from people when we don't actually know what they're thinking or feeling. So I find a lot of the judgments that we're making, a lot of the classifications we're making, do come from the Victorian period, and we just need to examine what we're doing a little bit more.
Right, and you talk about, you mentioned passports, so this is a thing, and certainly for anyone who goes to the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, to get their driver's license, you maybe can't smile. You've got to take your glasses off. Like this idea of a standardized look that we are all doing. It made perfect sense in terms of why you would need it, but also, as you point out, there's an element of control that exists that didn't happen before. That is a byproduct of that.
Absolutely. And until the First World War, really, not everybody wanted or needed to have a passport photograph, but also you could have passport photographs that included you hanging around at home with your extended family, at the piano, having a meal. They were much more about an expression of individuality. But the reduction of identity to this sort of a very sort of small area of the body, and you have to look, no facial expression in most countries, no head covering, very sort of increasingly narrow, became the ways in which we define who a person is, because it became more and more important who's crossing borders in the First World War, of course. But then, post 9/11, it became even more important. This sort of biometrics of the face became rolled out as sort of emergency legislation, I suppose. And so we've taken it for granted in the same way that we roll out facial recognition systems that identify people, even though we know it's fundamentally flawed. We just presume it must make sense, it must work, it must be the best way of knowing a person. And it's not so much that I have a problem with that, or I think that faces don't tell us things. It's more, let's think about why this has become so important, and what are the implications. And the implications are often that people are valued in hierarchies based on what they look like. Whether that's to do with their age or ethnicity, and increasingly facial difference as well, which is something that I work a lot on in the book. That is, people who have some sort of disfigurement, as it's called in legal terms.
There's also a leap that you make with regard to this that I found really interesting, because we have many technologists on the podcast who are aghast at the way that most people allow their information just to be used in the universe. And I think we blame a lot of that on young people and them being used to these devices in a different way, which makes some sense when you think about it. But you note that in the book, you say, quote, "Perhaps we are so casual about our data because we now take for granted that the face represents our legal and social selves. And perhaps we are so reluctant to address algorithmic bias because many of our technologies originated in Victorian prejudice and presumptions." So this idea that it's baked in a historical bent is wild, because that changes what that conversation is. And it probably changes how we might try to fix it.
Yeah, that is a question. How we would fix it is something that for me, it's very much about thinking about the different things that make up a person's humanity, because once we reduce them to something and give that part of the body meanings, we inevitably put them in hierarchies. And I think that sort of Victorian mindset is very core to the way that we think and we do social classification. But it is the case that there has been for centuries now an understanding that white people, and white men in particular, at the top of the social hierarchy, that comes from classical precedent, that comes from biblical ideas about color, and we've developed theories of race based on these, and we continue to use them. We know that facial recognition systems, for instance, routinely misrecognizes Black people and women because it's principally white men that are used to develop the algorithms. And so I think there needs to be a broader conversation about that and where it comes from. I do think also that a lot of the ways in which we're seeing on digital culture faces being used taps into stereotypes without us thinking about it. And I was quite interested in some of the ways in which politically Black faces become changed through AI to look more savage or more uncivilized. And we saw that with some of the AI modified images that were put out by Trump's government. And so they're doing something. When that happens, what is being done is it's not just a sort of violence against people, but it's also violence against people that is justified by tropes that go way back to the Victorian period and even beyond to the classical period. And so I think we need to be very conscious about what are we looking at when we look at the face, and what are the kind of presumptions that we're making, even about whether or not someone looks happy or unhappy. And as a person with resting bitch face, I'm really aware of this. We do make a lot of presumptions about a person's face, but often it might just be that they're confused rather than angry. And some of those decisions, if you think about it in courtroom settings, they have real impacts, particularly in terms of race. So we make presumptions about whether or not a person looks guilty. And if they look guilty, is it because they think they are guilty? Or is it that way that we all feel guilty when we're, approached by a policeman? In my experience, I think there's certain ways or codes that we take them for granted. And often I think it's because it's really convenient to do that. It's hard to kind of challenge those stereotypes, isn't it?
Well, and you mentioned so on our sister podcast, we had Amanda Knox on the pod. Yeah. And so having a conversation, and it was so interesting because, I mean, her story, and she's doing stand-up comedy now, which is really interesting. Wow. Yeah. And her guilt was almost exclusively based on the perception of her behavior, in terms of how she looked in responding to something, which is, terrible. Yeah. And also, I think we know this, like, we get it wrong most of the time with regard to these things.
We do. We get it wrong a lot, but there's a sort of confirmation bias that means that we're determined to keep to finding it true. And I think Amanda Knox is a particularly interesting case for me because the sort of physically I think she was performing cartwheels and smiling, and so she was behaving in ways that didn't conform to how women in particular are meant to look. Remorseful, but how you are supposed to look when you're guilty. And a lot of these assumptions, apart from anything else, they don't know what a person's feeling, and you could just be incredibly nervous. But also, it doesn't account for neurodivergence, and people don't necessarily move their faces or hold their faces in the ways that neurotypical people do. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding that we're constantly reproducing.
There's a thing you bring up in the book, and I'm turning 60 this year, and I look back in terms of these images from my youth in terms of when we first saw the Earth and that famous picture.
Yeah.
And the other were from Life magazine, and there was the series of photos of the fetus in the womb, and you introduced us to the Swedish photographer Lennar Nilsson.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because I found that really interesting.
Yeah, that's thank you. Well, what I wanted to understand was how early do we start putting faces and humanity on people? And it's an interesting question, I think, because if we want to feel compassionate about people, they have a human face. If we want to feel negative, we tend to caricature people. We see this happen with Jewish people. We see this happen with Black people. There's something about the face and how a person looks and the extent to which we can kind of emotionally relate to them that gives them status as human beings. And what I noticed really when thinking about the earlier studies into embryology and how the fetus developed was the way in which cameras had not only classified prisoners and people in the colonies and people in urban centres, but increasingly went into the womb. And where we see this transition whereby someone like William Hunter, who was one of two brothers, pathological anatomists in the 18th century, Hunter developed a lot of the early techniques involved in obstetrics. And his painstaking depictions of the fetus were very much about, he was interested in the womb. He was interested in what is happening inside a woman's body. And some of his images that were made are very much focused on musculature and in ways that seem quite violent to us, because you've got these truncated legs of the woman and these enormous bellies, but it's not telling a story of the fetus. We don't see the fetus is turned away from us. It's the womb in isolation. And so you don't have a sense of any sort of personhood being attributed to the embryo. With Nilsson, who's very much focusing on getting into the womb using special fiber optics, is very focused on trying to get the face. More than anything else, he wanted to get the face. And for Life magazine, he produced a series of images that tells the story of creation or sort of the birth of a human from conception through to delivery. And the idea is this is supposed to be, you get the feeling it's presented as a single fetus and its journey.
Yeah.
And what is quite remarkable about this is that they're extraordinary images, and they sold so many copies because it was for the first time we were able to see into the womb, and it was the time of the space race, and the fetus in the womb was being paralleled with the astronaut in space, because the images showed this tiny little brave fetus attached with the umbilical cord in the same way that you can imagine a sort of astronaut floating, attached to the spaceship. And so there was this paralleling of the brave journey of the fetus into the unknown in the same way that we had, civilization moving into space. It's very much about the frontiers of science. And when you actually read into what was happening is that only one of these images was of a fetus. in the womb. And the reason for that was that it's just too dangerous to do it. It wasn't possible. So actually, what he did was used aborted fetuses that he would arrange using, gold paint and fixing spray. And so it's entirely fictitious, but created and produced in a way that gives the idea and the sense of a person being born. It gives a story. It gives a sense of personhood. It gives a family. It's a very white family because it becomes part of a book. A child is born, this celebration of life. And interestingly, it's also the same time as there's a lot of debates on abortion and abortion rights. So it's a story really of how by shifting the perspective away from William Hunter and the uterus, which makes the woman's body central, it's about this brave little fetus that is starting this journey, and it gives personhood, in a sense, to the fetus. And so I think that has been very important in our understandings of, everything from women's rights to how, I suppose, how we emerge as individuals. If we're rooting it right back into the womb, if we're imagining the development of the human fetus in that way, it changes how we think about women's bodies, but it also changes how we think about that, embryonic journey. And that is very much about the face, being able to see the face, being able to watch the evolution of the face. And the images are quite extraordinary, with tiny little eyelashes and little tiny thumbs. But but he even arranged the fetus's thumb so that it was in his mouth and it was sucking his thumb and things like that. So it shows you, I think, what can be done. The power of the image, of course, and the power of photography, but also how even then it's sort of suspending our belief in terms of that we think we're following a journey where actually we're watching. We're watching snapshots of dead fetuses arranged in a kind of very particular order.
It's an extraordinary lie.
Yeah.
And it's similar to another extraordinary lie, which came up on the podcast a few years back with another author, whole other subject matter. But the idea in photography, of course, which was it couldn't capture black faces in any sort of accurate way. And the only reason it did, and you bring this up, is because furniture manufacturers complained.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that is another extraordinary lie, that when you understand that that's the reason that you decided to fix the lens of the image, should tell us everything we need to know about the problem that we still have today.
Yeah.
And yet it's not widely known. I mean, did you know this about this photographer with these images before you did research?
No,
I'd never heard.
No. I don't, I've seen I remember as a child seeing copies of the book and understanding this is a single person and this is what is happening, and isn't science wonderful and this is extraordinary. And it's sort of, I find it fascinating when you kind of go behind the scenes. And as you say, that the idea of the Shirley card that they used to use to judge whether or not a photo was color graded properly, entirely done on white skin. And so I suppose at the heart of the book is really a sense of technologies reproduce the beliefs and the prejudices that we have already in society. So no technology is neutral. It's how we use it. And I think that what you say about color photography is a point, is a case in point, isn't it? And we see it routinely, like those, there were the Google images of gorillas that were labeled as black people. Unless we're prepared to, and I suppose that comes back to the question of what we do with it, is like, how do we change the algorithms? How do we ensure that we're putting in the right things to make sure that we're getting a more kind of equitable representation of humanity?
So here's something I wanted to bring up with you that's related to all this, which is, so my wife also works at Second City. She's an academic. We've been here for years. We are students of this improvisational theater, which all the founders were at the University of Chicago in the 40s and 50s when Martin Buber was teaching there, Niebuhr, all these people. And so every once in a while, and my wife's a big reader as well, and she came to me, she's like, there's that, you know that TV show Lie to Me? And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, it's about this guy, Paul Ekman. He was at the University of Chicago with all the Second City people, and I think he knew them. And so this is like 15 years ago. So he was alive at the time. I found the number to his office. I called, and he called me back. My wife was in the office, and we had this really interesting conversation with Paul Ekman. So for people who maybe don't know Ekman, there was the TV show Lie to Me, but it's all about these micro expressions and the idea that you can read. He can tell when people are lying with all these micro expressions. And the conversation we had, and at the time, I took it at face value.
Yeah.
Took it at face value. The interesting thing from my point of view on all this was that not only was he at the University of Chicago with these founders of Second City, but for a very, very brief moment, he ran the lights for Mike Nichols, Elaine May, all these people who were creating improvisational theater.
Wow.
He ended up getting fired because he would fall asleep in the booth, which I feel is maybe a perfect metaphor for then the debunking that would then come on with regard to these micro expressions, because it's not good science.
Yeah, no, it's not good science, and it taps into it taps into lots of anthropological debates about what emotions are. And I suppose what's interesting about Ekman, so Paul Ekman has become so successful in talking about being able to read. He has a number of books. He's works on the development of cartoons. What was the cartoon? What was the film that had? Was it Inside Out?
Inside Out. Yeah, absolutely.
So he does a lot because it's taken for granted that a person's emotional expression is reflecting what they're feeling, and as you say, it's those sort of micro expressions that go up to determine whether a person is guilty or not. And so if we trace back the history of emotions, and we trace back the history of expression, which is what really got me into face transplants as a subject, because it was, if you have a face transplant, you can't join up all the networks of muscles and nerves. And so you lose the ability to do the incredibly complex emotional expressions that humans uniquely do, because communication and facial expression is so core to our way of being in the world. Unlike any other primate, so many more muscles than other primates. And so if you trace back the history of that, it only becomes kind of codified as a science, a sort of, a new science in the 17th century, and it is to do with stage work and performance and trying to kind of communicate, sadness and sorrow. And there were a series of distinct emotions that were set down by Descartes and depicted by Le Brun and so on. And so these depictions of what emotions look like in a person. I mean, again, I have to say that all Le Brun's images were white and mostly men, and and anger is male and sadness is female. So they're all very gendered, and they tie into this kind of Galenic idea, this humoral body, where there is no real division between mind and body, and everything is shown inevitably on the face. But these ways of presenting the passions and what they meant also dated back, of course, to classical ideas about physiognomy and pathognomy. So it wasn't simply that your static face revealed, like the line of your nose or the shape of your eyes represented what kind of person you are or how moral you were. It was also the way you expressed yourself through pathognomy was a way of indicating character. And so these two processes have been kind of filtered through. When you come to someone like Darwin, who is the person who gave rise to the scientific theory that on the expression of the emotions in humans and animals that Ekman later develops, he was really curious on he was actually curious in how to understand the relationship between humans and apes. And one of his ways into this was thinking about emotions and thinking about our emotional expressions as having a biological purpose. So, for example, we might grit our teeth when we're angry because, a common ancestor used to kind of bite and sort of fiercely fight. So it's always about how do we explain this in purely biological terms. So through this emergent science of emotion, we have ended up with usually 6 basic emotions, they call them. And so we're talking about anger, sadness, fear, love, shame. So there's some sort of movability in what counts as a sort of basic emotion, but they are fundamental emotions that are supposed to be core in everyone and expressed the same in everyone. And when Darwin put together this series of investigations, he said, and photography helped him because, of course, you can't hold an emotional expression for long. So he sent people around to sort of to interview people, to photograph them, to be able to compare them and chart them. And what he argued was that not only that all emotional expressions have some fundamental animalistic purpose. They're all biologically driven. We just might not use them anymore, but that's what they're for. That everybody expresses the same way. And as anthropologists started addressing this issue in the 70s particular, they were very interested in, is this really true? And so people like Margaret Mead investigated the ways in which people don't necessarily express emotions in the same way. And actually, there's a bias in the collecting of data. So Darwin's data set was tiny. It was sort of a handful of questionnaires. And to be honest, Paul Ekman hasn't done that much more. It's very much following that line. So, so his data collection was very much based on the same principle, but except that he would communicate a story and then ask people to point, ask people of the Foray tribe to point at the emotion that best summarized what that meant. But of course, there's so much in how you communicate a story. It's not a sort of simple thing to communicate a story. So those sorts of ideas about simple, defined emotions that are felt in a very precise way, that are separate from one another and are communicated in a very precise way, is at the heart of what Ekman is looking at. And more recent neuroscientists are very interested in actually, this isn't the case. People do emote differently. We are seeing what we think we're seeing. We definitely get emotions, and we read into expressions. We're not always reading the right thing. Faces aren't always doing what they think they are doing, but there's also lots of other ways of reading emotions, which have to do with gesture and to do with, voice. And we're doing ourselves a disservice, I think, by not looking at those, because the more we focus on the face, the more we kind of, and vision, the less we think about all of those other things. So as an emotion historian, I'm very interested in how ideas like Ekman's, that they have this very precise definition, which is very rigid, have become rolled out and end up, in FBI interviews, or they end up in cartoons that teach children what emotions are. Whereas in actual fact, emotions are culturally constructed, and the language in which we talk about them is different, but also our feelings are different. So, for example, if you take something like anger, it only makes sense to be angry at the world if you live in a system where you expect things to work out a certain way, or you have a particular sense of entitlement about something. I covered this quite extensively when writing about loneliness, is that loneliness is a composite of so many different emotions. You could be an angry and resentful young boy who feels lonely, or you could be, a sad and grieving widow who feels lonely. Loneliness is this state which hides all kinds of emotions. And to come back to the Amanda Knox example, if we are only seeing a very static, simplistic idea of what is happening on a person's face, reflecting what is happening, in their mind, then we are doing people a disservice. And all of those studies are only really based on young people, which is one of the reasons we have the problem with the resting bitch face. But they're also based on a very narrow, ethnic group. There's no real understanding of how people might change their expressions to suit who's in the room. Or, one of the examples I use is women are always being told to smile. Women are expected to smile and emotionally service people. And they smile when they're not happy. So there's so much more nuance. I think we're only just beginning to skim the surface of this. And as I say, some of the kind of really interesting, Lisa Feldman Barrett doing work on the neuroscience of emotion, she is showing the same thing that we historians who don't have brain scans have been suggesting for a while. So it's quite interesting to see those kind of come together. There's definitely a movement away from those narrow definitions of emotions, but they're so handy. They're handy to us in kind of making not just the split-second decisions that we make every day about, are we going to cross the road now? Do we like this person? but also they're helpful in us kind of, I don't know, working out who friends and foe are generally, and sort of trying to, I suppose, our worldviews are very based on the idea that there is a transparency between people.
Well, look, the world is incredibly complex.
Yeah.
I mean, so I'm conducting this interview with you. You are in London, right? Like,
Yeah.
so it's evening there. It's morning here. I've got my devices that keep ringing while I'm doing this, which I'm trying to ignore.
Yeah.
I've got my notes for the book, and then I'm also thinking about the millions of things you're talking about that are relating to both things I read in the book, but also this morning. So I had open heart surgery 8 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
So had a valve replaced, aorta essentially replaced, and I do cardiac rehab Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So this morning I had cardio rehab. Also last night, and this is in the States, I don't know if this is on your radar, but Stephen Colbert, who's a Second City alum, so he had his last show, and I'm doing I'm on the bike, and I talk to the nurses because that's what I do. And I'm like, did you guys watch the last Colbert? And they were all saving it up. They're like, no, we're going to watch it today. And I'm talking to the nurse. She's like, he's such a joyful human. I go, oh no, Stephen is completely joyful. And I think in part based, because I know him really well. Oh. My wife was his roommate at Northwestern. He was in my first cast at Second City. We are very dear friends. And he has had tremendous grief and sadness in his life, which the nurses did not know.
Right.
And so like, he seems so joyful, like why would that? And my wife and I lost our daughter to cancer 8 years ago when she was 17. And I'm like, well, you guys know me now. I've been here, and I'm a very joyful person. And like, oh, I guess you are. And I'm like, and Colbert talked about this with like Dua Lipa of all people, because she asked him if ever his faith touches his comedy, and this was the point where he was like, well, yeah, the laughter and the joy is the tonic I need in the face of the sadness, so I don't do evil, so that I'd like that is this very powerful tool. And he did it so beautifully in terms of his, because he's Stephen Colbert. But I was in terms of everything you're talking about too, which is like, I can see why you would, of course you're going to make that assumption. There's just too many other things going on. However, we do that to our detriment. And we do that in many ways. And Nick Epley is a scientist we work with at the University of Chicago. And I remember he was observing a class that my wife was teaching. And the exercise they were doing was there was a person translating gibberish. Two people were having a conversation in a pretend language, and then they were translating. And at the end of the exercise, he asked if he could ask some questions. And basically, the big question he asked each of them was, do you think that the translator was accurately translating for each of them? People were like, yeah, it felt like that. And then when they said what they basically thought they were saying through the gibberish, it was not anywhere close. And that's his research, which is like, we think we know what's going on.
Yeah.
And we can't. It's just, maybe we get it right on occasion. But that's not correct. And this whole book centered on this is like, what are you doing with the face that you think it says this one thing or not, and you're not taking into account everything. And I think the face transplant thing was fascinating because you're very careful in that chapter, but it doesn't strike me after reading that chapter that I would qualify any face transplant as successful. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. I think about this a lot, and I work with the surgeons on trying to define what it means. Yeah. What I find really interesting about face transplants is, or what success means. What I found really interesting about face transplants is that it taps into this this idea of a before and after, which is so core to our cultural belief system. I mean, how many times do we think about makeovers or home transformations? We like the before and after. So when face transplants are reported, and there's only been 50 since 2005, so they're a very rare form of surgery used when people have had horrendous injuries to their face. We see the before and after. So we see the disfigured image, and then we see the successful image. And that tells a particular story about scientific medicine having, excelled in being able to, give people back what they've lost. And that's something that's important to the story of modern medicine, because experimental medicine, which face transplants are, and hand transplants and penis transplants, and all these kind of transplants that are called VCA, or vascularized composite allografts, they're a very specific, still experimental form of transplant. All of these surgeries are attempts to push the frontier all the time of medicine. And so one of the things I became interested in when I was thinking about this is, what is it about the face that's different? And we don't have them in the UK. And we don't have them in the UK because even though the UK was likely to be the first before the first one in 2005, the UK was going to do it in 2003. And the Royal College of Surgeons said, this is a bad idea. We don't know how somebody is going to feel looking in the mirror and seeing a different face. We don't know how the donor's family is going to feel. We don't know the impact of immunosuppressants on the system. And if the problem is in that regard is if you have a new heart and you take immunosuppressants, we know that immunosuppressants suppress your immune system, and you're more likely to get cancer, you're more likely to have kidney failure. But that is a trade-off, because otherwise you'll die. With face transplants, they call them life-enhancing rather than life-saving. And so that means that you are no longer going to be vilified on the street because you no longer look disfigured. So there's an awful lot of that in it. It's actually, a lot of it is about how people treat us when we have facial injuries. Some of it is because the face has a particular set of functional aspects. So we chew, we smile, we drink. You know, if you lose those kind of functional aspects, it does actually affect your quality of life. Now, the problem is in medical terms that the ways in which it's been measured as a success is the graft holding? Have you managed to retain the face? Now, we do have a high mortality rate. The 10 people of the 50 that have had the transplants have died. So we have a high mortality rate. And we know that the quality of life, as it's measured by surgical metrics, which is this graft holding, is blood flow good, how many rejections have you had? And you will reject all the time. I mean, you have frequent rejections when you have face transplant. And so that's the measure of success. And if it holds for a certain amount of time, that's fine. We still don't know how long it will hold, because we're saying 10, 15 years tops. We don't know. We don't have enough people that have had it yet. We do know that in systems where, like the US, where there is not a state healthcare system, it's far harder to have a good quality of life, because you don't have support, and the medication is so expensive. You don't have support even getting to hospital and back. So I found this part of the research, a very emotional, challenging journey, because I spent a lot of time with face transplant recipients and their families, with people who were thinking about face transplants, with people who ultimately died while we were working together. It's an area of medicine where you have incredibly vulnerable people and you have incredibly skillful surgeons. And sometimes they don't necessarily speak the same language. That's the reality of all kinds of experimental medicine. Because in a sense, one has to always keep going and experimenting to be able to reach some future where something becomes a standard of care. However, I don't personally think they'll ever become a standard of care. The funding is drying up. They're mostly funded in the US by the Department of Defense as experimental surgery. And I think the outcomes are not sufficiently great to show that they should become a first line of treatment. So it's a really interesting example of firstly, the fact that different parts of the body are more emotional than others. And so, transplant surgery has always kind of led the way, really, in terms of medical experimentation since the 50s. But it's also I think, a reminder that we have to really think about the holistic person. We can't treat the face as just one part of the body. When having a face transplant affects the whole system, and not just the physical body, but the social body around it. Because there are families of people who've had face transplant who no longer feel comfortable that the person is the same person. In the main, the fear that people wouldn't feel like themselves by seeing somebody else in the mirror, in the main, that concern hasn't really been borne out. And the reason for that, I think, is that when you have a face transplant, you've normally not had a face for quite a long time. So you've got used to the idea of having a damaged face. And then having a new face is not quite the same as having your face today and then somebody else's face tomorrow. So there's all kinds of issues like that. I think there needs to be more work in thinking through not just the impacts, but what are the impacts on donor families? Because we know that the face doesn't look exactly like the person it's come from. There's a problem in shortage of faces, as there's problems with lots of organs for donation. There's all kinds of racial implications because Black people don't donate in the same numbers for perfectly legitimate reasons to do with trust in medicine. And interestingly, all sorts of issues around colour matching. One of the people I work with, Robert Chelsea, who I've known for some years now, when he first was offered a face transplant, there were only 3 shades available. And it didn't occur to anybody at that point that one had to have more variety of shades, because Black people have such a vast difference in colour to white people in terms of the differences. And so because of Robert's face transplant, the number of shades available that a patient can say, I'd be happy between 6 and 7, or I'd be happy between 3 and 10. The range, I think it extended to something like 17. And my conversations with Robert in particular were very much around, as a Black man, I need my face to represent my ethnic identity because this is how I define myself. And so it opens up this space, face transplants, for all kinds of broader conversations, not just about what the face is for, but what does identity mean? And for women too, women's face transplants are always attached to ideas about what women are supposed to look like.
Sure.
So, and surgeons, plastic surgeons in particular, often see themselves as artists, and with very clear ideas about what beauty is. So all of this stuff, it doesn't get left behind when people go into theatre. It's it's in us. All of these ideas about what the face is and should be, they run through us.
Yeah, I mean, I think too about what technology has brought to us with regard to my wife Anne was teaching she was a caregiving conference in LA, and she was teaching an improv workshop for caregivers, and there was a number of non-English speakers, and they're like, oh no, we've got this device. So she had a microphone, everyone had these earphones. It was like we solved the Tower of Babel. Like, I was like, what? And she goes, it was the most amazing experience because in real time, her words are being translated
Wow.
and back to her. And I'm like, oh my God, that changes everything. And then, and they've got, people who were born, unable to hear have can hear. And, and you said something interesting too, because I remember earlier you were talking about the before and the after with the face, but there's 3 faces.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes. And actually in some cases there are 4, because 2 people who've had a face transplant, the face has died and they have had another transplant. And one of the reasons that face transplants are so problematic, even in relation to hand transplants, is in order to have the face transplant, everything that you have has to be removed. And so if that fails, you're in a lot of difficulty. And twice new faces have been found. So someone like Carmen Tarleton, who was attacked by her husband and lost her face. So she had her original face that always changes through our lives anyway. It's hard enough dealing with those changes. And then she had the face that was burned. And then she had the new face. And then she lost that face. And then she had another face. And also what was interesting to me and must have been very challenging was that she had a relationship with the family of the donor face that then died. And I do wonder what it's like for them, because the whole language of transplant is very much about, these connections and the gift. And yet if you are still connected to the face that's given, and you in some way are still associating that face with your loved one, I wonder what that's doing to our transformation of identity or connection. And often they are, they become friends with the donor family, and then that introduces a whole other level of obligation when people often have survivor guilt anyway. So there's a lot of ethical issues around there that still haven't been worked out. And then what's it like when if you give your mother's face to somebody who needs a face and you have a bond with that person, when the face dies, is that a second kind of grief? Is that a second bereavement? So all of those things have not been worked out. I think a lot of surgeons would argue, well, it was the same with heart transplants. We had a lot of problems before we, knew really what the field looked like. And that brings me back to the question of yes, but, how are we measuring if this is a good exchange? Because you might only be having 10 years with a new face. And your body is also being subjected to the immunosuppressants. So, yeah, I think there's a lot still. It's still a very ethically challenging area.
Yeah.
Even
Yeah,
leaving
yeah.
aside the kind of fact that of identity, it's as a form of surgery. We don't know yet.
No, no, no. In a moment, I'm going to ask you for a yes and story.
Oh,
When I was going through my notes for the book, I recognized that I have a lot of big paragraphs that you wrote because there's some beautiful writing in the book. And I ended up, and I was going to sort of apologize before we started if I start reading a bunch, and I ended up, the conversation went different places. But there is one little thing that comes at the end of the book that I do want to read because I think it's really beautiful. You write, quote, "The face, in the end, is both everything and nothing. It's the first thing we notice about each other and the last thing that truly matters about who we are. Face transplants force us to confront this paradox directly. In trying to give people new faces, we discover that the face we seek, the one that will make us whole, acceptable, lovable, might not exist at all. It might be that what we're really seeing is not a new face, but a new world, one that doesn't judge us so harshly for the face we already have," end quote. That's really a lovely way to sort of conclude that part of the book because we don't want to not seek the technology. We recognize that there are so many things that we can
yeah,
do, but of course at the end it's the human. And I think about, you talk about Robert, who is his name, who's you've
Robert
befriended, right?
Shields. Yeah.
And his daughter didn't want him to get the face
No,
transplant, right?
no, she's uncomfortable with it. And Ebony is an extraordinary young woman, but she's quite honest, and she says, "I only know it's him when he opens his mouth and I hear his voice." And she
Yeah.
doesn't, she's never quite adjusted to it. But thank you for reading that, because I think what seems to me really quite striking from all of the research that I've done is, particularly now in the digital age, where we are increasingly interested in the face as something that can be improved and changed, and we see the kind of rising levels of dissatisfaction with how we look, particularly starting very young. And there's this sort of the quest for something, the quest for perfection, which means that people are filtering their faces and desperate to undergo cosmetic surgery to look younger, to look beautiful, to look. I mean, not only is that emphasizing the kind of the European basis we've already talked about, where it's white faces that are always considered the most beautiful, but it's a very self-defeating quest, and that saddens me, because we all have days when we don't feel great about our appearance. But if we think about it in terms of cosmetic surgery, we're chasing something that we don't get, because in the end, what we find is that the more that we transform one area of ourselves, it just makes another part of ourselves feel, shabby by comparison. And it might be, of course, yes, I'm not saying cosmetic surgery doesn't have a function. Sometimes it does, but there's a quest for perfection that's quite central to Instagram and to visual social media, and it leaves a lot of humanity behind. That's what I have noticed. Yeah, and often because cosmetic surgeons are allowed to advertise on Instagram, and the two have kind of grown together like a vine. There's a lack of clarity and accountability, and I think that's something, wanting to look like somebody else, and this fantasy of the perfect face has been around since, well, forever. But we have really leaned into that since the 1950s, and sort of consumer and celebrity culture. And I think there are organisations that prioritise what it is to look facially different, or the limitations of what cosmetic surgery can do. But I do think we have to have much more social conversations about the limits of it, and actually, being okay as we are.
Yeah, exactly. All right. We always end the conversation asking our guest for a yes and story. Do you have one for us?
Yes, I do actually. I was invited to take place in a a project that was about developing avatars to stop loneliness. And this project, it takes an image of your face, multiple images of your faces, and it creates an avatar of you. And the idea is that it's supposed to prevent people from feeling lonely. And my first reaction was that because I am all about the body and the physical and the connection, I was really nervous about it. Through doing the work, I do not feel that digital technologies will ever replace human encounters. But I do think we have to lean into what it's for and how it can be used, because it's not going anywhere. And so I realized that by saying yes to this project that I had in the past been quite suspicious about, there's a way of really interrogating what the face is for. Because increasingly, if we are finding that elderly people, for example, living in care homes, are not having enough visitors, are lonely, are spending their time alone, and they are not having human caregivers, is it ethically appropriate to introduce avatars of their loved ones? If people do that, what will it look like? How do we make sure it's safe? And through that question, I really started thinking about the ways in which it's very unexplored, but we know that people with dementia start to not be able to identify people. And that willingness to step outside of my comfort zone and step into this sort of digital experiment was productive in lots of ways, but it was also productive in thinking about the ways in which one of the very fundamental parts of arriving in the world and discovering our humanity is when babies look at our faces and they start to learn us, and they're desperately learning what we look like. And it's almost as though at the opposite end, when we become very elderly and we start to kind of lose social connections, it's a loss of that, and a loss of the social integration. And it seems to me there's sort of quite an unexplored loop in how that happens. So I am interested in doing more of this kind of work and understanding, and particularly around neurodivergence, and particularly in terms of the circumstances in which we don't recognize people, I think are as interesting as those in which we do.
So I mentioned some of our work with the caregivers, and this is my me search moment. When my mom got dementia, and I would sit with her, and she would start talking about her nursing, and because she was a nurse way long ago, not now, but I kept trying to get her back to sort of the reality of it, and it was very frustrating for me, for her, for the whole family. And she passed. I had not written my book yet, but I'd lived inside this world of Yes and I'm in the car and I'm driving and I'm listening to This American Life on National Public Radio, Ira Glass's show, and there's a couple who were improvisers who were talking about one of their moms who had dementia, and that they used Yes and with them, that they realized that it didn't matter. And that when they did that, they went to these really interesting, lovely places, and they talked about the monkeys in the yard, and they didn't, she never in danger, and I'm like, and I literally had to pull over, and I'm sobbing because I'm like, my life's work, and I didn't seek to even understand to apply it in a situation where I could have, and then realizing, like, I want to explore this more, that this feels important, because it and there is research now around the idea that one doesn't need to block, and that there and that people can, and music, and there's other art forms that do bring people back in. So I think your Yes and story is exactly, it's very similar to mine, which is like, oh no, this is a worthy endeavor to explore, where they need people like us who think about the ethical aspect of it, and it's not a replacement. It's simply this is a thing that happens, and let's see. The book is amazing. It's called The Face: A Cultural History. Fay Bound Alberti, thank you so much for sharing so much time with us.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.